Welcome back, fam. It's your boy JB in the place to be, and today's video was requested by Oshula Jones and Roberto Gutierrez. Okay, these two gentlemen requested a video concerning the OTDR, such as what is an OTDR and what would it be used for, right? So in the hopes of not being extremely technical, in the spirit of using words that everybody else can understand, we're going to dummy down this entire video so that everyone can benefit, right? So OTDR is an abbreviation for optical time domain reflectometer, right? It's a device that's used to characterize the nature of the fiber based on key parameters, right? Those parameters are set by your company as what is acceptable fiber calibration, acceptable thresholds of use, and what would fail or pass a end-to-end validation, right? Yeah, so for ease of navigation throughout the video, right here you should see some timestamps. I've broken the video into 3 parts. The first part is theory, right? The second part is the actual device, right? And the third part is a few experiments that I put aside. So, what's the OTDR, right? The OTDR, as described earlier, it's an optical time domain reflectometer, right? It fires lasers, not harmless lasers. It fires lasers down the optical fiber, and it waits on a reflection, right? Thus the reflectometer. So how does this operate, right? It does have a laser that energizes a pulse, sends it down the fiber optic line, right? Once it reaches an event, a reflection is then sent back towards the OTDR. Inside the OTDR, there's multiple photodiodes that would register the reflected light, and then that is used to draw up a picture, which we call a trace, that's used to draw up the trace of the characterization of the fiber, right? So to reiterate, it shoots a beam of light, it shoots a pulse down the fiber, waits on it to come back, bam. And it doesn't just run one pulse, right? It sends multiple pulses, right? So, and it just waits on them to come back. So what's an event, right? An event is a reflection, obviously, right? Events happen because the pulse of light has hit something, and now it just came back. So what kinds of events are there? So this PDF is titled the OTDR Trace Analysis, right? And what we see here is 2 traces, right? We can see the black is in 1550 nanometers. We can see that the purple or fuchsia, violet, we can see that the bottom one is 1310 nanometers, right? If we just move on from top to the bottom, we can see that the first event registered on this whole trace is a front-end reflection event, right? This is basically the start of the trace, right? It's where your launch kit or the patch cable is connected into the OTDR, right? That creates a reflection, right? If we move to the next point, we can see the connector, which mechanically connects 2 fibers together that can create a reflective event, right? Yeah. In this particular instance, it's not talking about the connector per se. It's talking about a coupler with 2 connectors, right? A connector being connected and lined up properly to another connector, right? We're going to go into that shortly. I'm going to show you very shortly, right? Next step down, we see a ghost, right? A very scary ghost, but it's nothing to be worried about. Spikes like this could scare a new technician, but the only thing you're really seeing is a reflection event, right? According to this document, it's an unexpected event resulting from a strong reflection causing echoes in the trace. Typically, you would see reflections at the start of your trace, and it would be mimicked at the end of the trace, right? So let's just say your fiber is supposed to be, I don't know, 30,000 feet, right? So you should see a spike at the start and a spike at the end, right? And it'll tell you that there's X amount of feet in between these two spikes, right? But in some cases, you'll see a spike at the point of origin, and then you'll see another spike like 1,500 feet later, right? And then you'll see the other end of the fiber, which is still 30,000 feet, okay? But at 31,500, you'll see a spike there as well. That's a ghost, right? Furthermore, if your pulse is too strong, you'll see a spike at the start. Let's just use 30,000 feet again. You'll see a spike at the end. That's your fiber. But then you'll see another spike 60,000 feet away in the noise floor. That's how you know it's a reflection. We're going to go into what the noise floor is momentarily as well. But we're going to stick with this chart just to move forward quickly. At point 4, we can see attenuation dead zone, right? This is basically the space in between the event where signal is lost, okay? At point 5, we can see a fusion splice. Yeah, here, a fusion splice uses a splicing machine to thermally fuse two fibers together, right? It should say that there's no reflectance, right? But there is loss. If you ask me, this is a horrible splice. My splices are normally just straight across, man. You can run the whole trace and not even notice it. They're just that beautiful, man. Yeah, but then we also have gainers. Gainers, according to this document, a splice that appears after splicing together two fibers of different backscatter coefficients. Basically, two different size cores, okay? So then we have a mechanical splice, which aligns two fibers together using a self-contained assembly. It's a way of aligning the fibers so precisely that it mimics a fusion splice, right? Using gels and adhesives, okay? So then we have the event dead zone, right? It's basically the same as the attenuation dead zone, right? Dead zone should be a dead giveaway, right? When you're in the field and you're using your OTDR, you're not about to try to figure out why there is an event inside of your spike. You're basically going to try to correct that event. You're going to try to get rid of this reflection, right? You're going to try to correct the loss and get rid of the reflection. Like I said, this is basically for new people, right? Then we have the fiber end or break, right? That's where your money shot is, right? It's the end of the fiber. According to this document, the fiber end or break refers to where the fiber terminates, supposedly. The end reflection depends on the fiber and cleavage and its environment, okay? Okay, so here we have the OTDRs and the optical explorers lined up so neatly inside of my trailer, right? And here we're going to have a look at the GUIs, right? The graphical user interface. And yes, you may have to press it a few times. That's just the way it is, man. But we will see here that the software is basically the same, right? The only thing that's different is the firmware, the innards, the circuitry and stuff. Right here we can see a couple of knobs. We can see the frequency, range, pulse, and duration, right? We can also see at the top that it says source, events, and measure. Okay, right here we can change the frequency that we're going to use. I know we really call this thing in the field, we call it a fault finder, right? All it's going to tell you basically is where the cable is broken. But right here we can see the knobs. You can calibrate the range between feet and kilofeet, okay? And we can see that the knobs are basically the same here, right? Pulses are the same. The frequencies, you can swap in between those. There you go, right? It's the same model, right? This model has like 8 different frequencies that it can be configured to use, but that's when it's coming from the factory, right? And if we look at the top here, okay, we can see this black port over here. That's the optical power meter. This other port that's right next to it, that's the VFL, visual fault finder, fault locator. We can see ports here to expand the functionality. And to the right, we can see ports that we would use to connect the connectors to. We can see that there's different seconds for duration, different spans for the pulse, and the range. We have a variety that we can pick from, right? Yeah. So now if we look at the pulse and the range knobs, right? The pulse is how big that beam of light's gonna be, right? How big that pulse of light is gonna be, right? And the range is how far you're gonna set the OTDR screen, right? That's all it is, man. If you set the range too short, that line's gonna go right across like here, and you won't see the end of it, right? You won't know how long the fiber is. Yeah, just a bit of wisdom for using this device. If you think the footage is like, let's say 25,000 feet, you would then set the footage on your OTDR to 32.8 kilofeet, 32,800 feet, right? But you would also orient the pulse width in the same fashion. So if you have the range set to 32.8, you want to set your pulse to like 100 nanoseconds or 275 nanoseconds, right? That's just food for thought. That's why it's laid out like this, right? You can see that like for shorter distances, you would want a shorter pulse, right? So you would set it for just under 1,000 feet, 0.98, and you would set the pulse for 5 nanoseconds, right? Long pulses for long spans, short pulses for short spans. Then we run into the duration, right? Why is the duration important? The duration is how long these tests are going to run, right? So let's say it's set for 5 seconds. It's going to send out pulses and wait for reflections for 5 seconds consistently, right? That only tells you so much information, right? But if you want a clearer picture, you run it for 10 seconds. And if you want an even more precise picture, you run it for 15 and so forth. The more reflections that come back, that's the more information that's being built on the fiber. A better picture. Fiber optic characterization. Okay? All right, so here is me just putting together the experiment apparatus we're going to use to just highlight a few points here. Okay? We're going to use 2 different launch kits, both of which are 1,600 feet. Okay. We're going to use Brenda, obviously. Some standard connectors that I just have lying around. And we're going to use this bulkhead coupler, right? As you can see, the coupler has 2 sides to it. It's not connected to anything. We're going to use that to join the 2 points of these connectors that we have here. All right. Just going to speed this up. Just going to speed that up. So here in the counter, all right, we can see that we're using bare fiber connected to these jumpers, connected to these connectors, and we're going to splice more connectors onto the All right. So here we're running our experiment, right? All we see is noise floor for some reason, but as we adjust the distance and the pulse, we start to see a different characterization of the fiber. As the pulse is too slow, is too short, all we see is noise, right? Because that's all it's looking for. But as we increase the pulse, right, we can see that the characterization is different, right? So here I'm just making sure my launch kit settings are not put in play. We don't see anything there, right? So we're just going to change the distance to 4,000 feet because we have 2 launch kits, which should equal around 36,000 feet. And there we have it. We have a start reflection, and then we have the end of the fiber. But what we're going to pay attention to is that spike in the middle, right? That spike in the middle is coming from this bulkhead, right? And what we're going to do is we're going to simulate a macro bend right there, right? We're going to bend this bare fiber, okay? Now, as we bend it, we should see a cliff, and that's what we're seeing, right? You can use this tactic, this method, to try to identify fibers in the field in the event that you don't have a traffic ID, right? This is disruptive to very sensitive equipment, but if you're just running tests and if you know there's no businesses on here, you can just basically have at it, man. So again, we're just going to look at the coupler here, and if we disconnect one of our fibers, we should see, bam, okay, just like we said earlier, this is the fiber end, right? We'll see the same thing if we do it on the opposite side, and even if we put a bend here, bam, right at the start. Okay, this fiber is connected directly to the fiber connector inside of Brenda here. Okay, yeah, there we go, bulkheads, baby. Oh yeah. All right, so here is actual footage of myself trying to find a fiber in the field using macro bends, right? Some of these fibers are so large, you just have to use it, man. So I have a guy out in the middle of nowhere, and he's going to start putting bends on the fiber, and I should be able to see it here, right? Oh, there it is right there. Did you see it? Right, so typically, once he's found the right fiber, I would tell him to hold it, and then I would shoot the fiber to get the exact distance as to where he is in the plant, how close he is to the damage, or if he's using the correct fiber for our project. Yeah. So just to tie it all together, right here we have a theoretical damage span, right? We shot the fiber. Apparently the damage is at the very end of the fiber, right? If we were just to use our maps, right? The damage is at the very end, which is 2,577 feet away. But I'm here to tell you that it's not, okay? In this little example, right, we know that the OTDR is supposed to tell us how long the fiber is. So theoretically, if the point of origin is here and we shoot the fiber and it says it's going so far and we just walk out that distance, we should arrive at the damage, right? The damage should be right here at the very bottom. But it's not, right? It's not. And this is something you'll find in the field, right? This is something you'll find out in the field. It's kind of frustrating when you forget this basic frame of thought. But once you figure it out, everything makes sense, right? The damage isn't at this point here, right? The damage is not there. I'm going to tell you why. It's not there because you didn't account for storage, which is fiber stored in the plant, right? It's stored in horseshoes, right? Just in case there's a damage, you can pull this slack, this storage out, and use that to repair the damaged fiber, right? So you didn't account for storage. You didn't account for risers, right? Because there's vertical travel sometimes. Sometimes a fiber cannot go the complete distance aerial or the complete distance underground, right? Sometimes that fiber has to go up and down poles, right? And that's called vertical travel, right? You need to factor that in. Okay, how much would you know to factor in? A good rule of thought is to factor in about 0.15 of length loss, right? The third thing you want to factor into your equation, your frame of mind, your troubleshooting, is cable sag, right? Cable sag. If you're ever driving down the street, you'll notice that whether they be power lines or cable lines or fiber optic lines, they just don't go straight across, right? They just don't travel from pole to pole in a straight line. They travel from pole sagging to the next pole, right? That's sag. And what it does, it theoretically shortens the overall length of the fiber, right? The overall physical distance of the fiber, I should say, okay? Because it's not as long if it's being coiled to a degree. See what I'm saying? So here in this image, we can see that the theoretical distance between these two poles and the fiber should be 125 feet, but the actual distance would include this sag, right? And if we factor that in, the actual distance is just a scotch more, right? It's just a scotch more. But this becomes a problem if the span is extremely long. These small inches, they add up. They turn into feet, and then they turn into yards, and then your whole night's ruined because you forgot this one thing. Furthermore, we can see that as the line goes up the pole, right, we can see that it loses 30 feet, right? And then as it goes back down, it loses another 30 feet in physical distance, right? Yeah. That's why it's important to pay attention to the markings on the fiber, right? If you look at the writing on the fiber, you would see the manufacturer, the date of production, the serial number, as well as the footage of the fiber at that point. Okay, once you have the footage at this point, you could just walk it out however far, right? And then you would get the footage of the fiber at that point. Subtract the two numbers, and you'll then come up with a figure of how long the span is, right? Use that number, factor it into how close you should be to the damage, where the OTDR says the damage is, and then you can find out whether you're either closer to the damage or you've gone past it. There you go. You'll be right on top of it eventually, right? Okay, all right. So lastly, we want to talk about the VFL, right? The visual fault locator, right? Or visual frequency light, right? This thing is invaluable when troubleshooting a broken fiber at night. Oh, yeah. So what it does is it shines a red light through the fiber so that you can see it. So you can see where this break is, right? It's easier to find a blinking light than a static one. And so there you have it in a nutshell. That's the OTDR, the optical time domain reflectometer. Its usage, a few tips of the trade as well. Also a few fun experiments. So I hope you guys really enjoyed it, right? And if you found value in today's video, go ahead and hit that Cash App or even buy me a coffee. Links in the description, right? And if you guys want to take it a step further, just go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe, right? Thank you so much, and you guys have a nice one. Peace. Coffee's cold, man.